You guys can go ahead and bring up the first slide if you want to here. Aging myself. Yes, that we're to tell the truth. We're starting a series this morning over the next few months where I'll be talking about some of the cultural lies that our society tells us. And we want to go through a few of those. I don't know how many we'll have, maybe three or four or five of those. But what we're suggesting in this study is that much of what we've heard from our society and from our culture really isn't worth listening to. So much of it is just outright lies. Some of you are old enough in this room to remember the logo on the screen right here. That came from a game show that actually started back in 1956. And some of you are thinking, 1956? Yeah. Um, Still runs in syndication today. It's still out there in different places. You can find it. And the premise of the show that was on TV all those years ago, Joe Garagiola was the moderator, I guess you'd call him, or the host. But you had four panelists, celebrities, and they would try to guess the identity of the contestant. And you had three contestants, and somebody had done something noteworthy, something that was kind of famous, but he was kind of behind the scenes, and so he was not easily recognized in all of that. And so there would be one who would tell his story, and then there would be two others that would be trying to bluff their way through telling kind of made up stories and trying to fool everybody. And the other person was sworn, and they all had their hands up. That's why the hand is up. Had their hand up and swore to tell the truth. Now, some of you who are a bit younger than that might remember the movie Catch Me If You Can, where that movie was actually on. That was actually shown in the theater or the game show, part of that. Frank William Abagnale. I don't know if you remember the name, but that was his name. Um, Leonardo DiCaprio played that particular character. Tom Hanks was always trying to find him, but he was one of the most successful forgers of bad checks. And he posed as a doctor, and he posed as a lawyer, posed as a pilot, had none of those credentials. Could hadn't and how he got through, but it was an amazing kind of thing. Estimates went as high as that he swindled as much as $6 million. Eventually, he was so good at passing by checks, the FBI hired him to be able to help them find those guys who were actually doing that. And so the game show, to tell the truth, basically said that celebrities, if you gave them enough time, if you gave them enough questions, they could tell just by those questions who was telling the truth and who was the imposter. More times than not, they were fooled. Now, I think what happens to us in our culture is we kind of find ourselves in the same place. We think to ourselves that if we had the chance, we could listen to what society is telling us and what it's trying to get across to us, and we could basically tell whether or not that is true. And our society, particularly, is pretty good at telling us those untruths. And so the Bible tells us in Proverbs chapter 4, you be careful how you think. Your life is shaped by your thoughts. Thinking is vitally important for us. And it's not always easy to think truthfully, is it? In a culture that tells us all the time all these untruths and is dominated by that. But I think sometimes we Christians believe that we could do that. But there's this conflict in there because sometimes Christians also think to themselves that we know where untruths come from, right? Devil's the father of lies. Every time he speaks, he's speaking his native tongue. So we think to ourselves that Satan is behind all of those cultural lies that society tries to send to us. Now, the thing about the devil is he's pretty shrewd, and he doesn't just throw out the lie. He dresses it up, doesn't he? He makes it look truthful. He makes it look like it really is true, and it sounds true, and many people buy into those untruths. Well, this morning we want to talk about one of those cultural lies about the wonderful, beautiful, sometimes difficult institution called marriage. And I don't have to tell you, if you've been married for any kind of time at all, that marriage can be a difficult proposition. A minister was teaching his second grade class in the church. He decided he was going to go down and teach the kids. And so he's got a second grade class one Sunday morning, and he asked, "What does Jesus say about marriage?" And they all kind of looked at one another. They're second graders, right? They all kind of looked around at one another for a while, and finally, one little hand went up in the back. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I've had that thought before as I stood on a stage very similar to this one and had a couple standing here in front of me, and they were making all kinds of promises and all kinds of vows and commitments to one another forever and for eternity until life is over and all those things. And they were very, very sincere in everything that they were saying. But I thought to myself, there is no way in the world they understand the depth of the commitment that they're making here. God is the author of marriage, and he created the institution to be a blessing. That's why Proverbs tells us, chapter 18, verse 22, he who finds a wife, remember, he finds a good thing, and he receives favor from the Lord. But what happens to us is when marriage as the ideal becomes an ordeal, there are a lot of folks out there that are saying, can I have a new deal? Right? And so that's the thing that we want to think about for a few moments today. Okay? The cultural lie is this: marriage shouldn't be this hard. Well, doesn't the Bible say that marriage is good? Absolutely. But where does the Bible ever say that marriage is not hard? And so we as Christians, I think, ought to know better than most of the world out there that marriage can be hard and it can be difficult. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28, in the context of that chapter right here, Paul will say, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And he said, I'm not here to try to tell you not to get married right here, but you need to go in understanding what's going on here. And so it's time to replace fiction with fact, right? Marriage is good, but it has never been easy. The truth of the matter is that every marriage is intended by heaven to be a continual work in progress. And that doesn't matter if you've been married for a few weeks or a few months or a few years or a few decades. When marriage is clicking on all cylinders, there is no blessing on earth that's sweeter. We know that's the case. There's a whole book in the Bible, right? Song of Solomon. And in that particular book, and it talks about the beauty of marital love, that particular book, there's a couple that are deeply in love, and they're in the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. Chapter 2, verses 2 through 5. I love this. The couple that are talking back and forth to one another, and the husband says it this way to his wife: like a lily among thorns is my darling among the maidens. And then she replies back, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my lover among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste, and his banner over me is love. He has taken me to his banquet hall. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. My wife talks to me that way every morning. What, that's not the way y'all talk with one another? Have you noticed? It's so much easier to fall in love than it is to stay in love. But no marriage can survive on romantic feelings alone, because we know about feelings, right? Feelings are up and down. Feelings change. Feelings are here and then they're gone. And so there's no way for us to stay married to one another based just upon romantic feelings. They're unstable. Their intensity rises and falls. And so the same guy who said, my wife is a darling among the maidens, good old Solomon, he's also the one who said in chapter 27 of Proverbs, a nagging wife is like water going drip, drip, drip on a rainy day. How can you keep her quiet? Same guy said the same thing. According to marriage counselors, you know what the number one question is that they face? why don't we love each other like we used to? That's the question that they're asked most often. Well, I want to suggest to you that there are at least four things that we're going to talk about this morning for just a couple of moments here. Four factors, we're calling it, to help us understand that marriage is hard. Here's the first one. Marriage is hard because of the familiarity factor. You remember when you got that first new car, or the first car that was new to you? Man, you washed it every week and waxed that thing and you cleaned it out, and you wouldn't let anybody eat in your car because they might drop a crumb or two in there. Now, if you threw a seed in the back seat, something would probably sprout and grow, right? Now, you still value your car. It still serves its purpose, but it's almost impossible to sustain the intensity of your feelings that you had when it first became yours. The same thing is true about your marriage. What is new becomes familiar, and what is familiar is often taken for granted. I don't know if you've ever read this story, but it came out several years ago. It's called The Seven Ages of the Marital Code. Okay? Seven stages or the seven ages of the marital code. It was in Saturday Evening Post several years ago. Listen, first year, wife has a bad cold, so the husband responds, sugar dumpling. That ought to tell you right there, first year, right? Sugar dumpling, I'm worried about my baby girl. You got a bad sniffle, and there's no telling about these things with all the strep going around. I'm going to put you in the hospital this afternoon for a thorough examination and some good rest. I know the food's lousy, but I'll bring you meals from the Cheesecake Factory. I've got it all arranged with your floor superintendent. Second year. Listen, darling, I don't like the sound of that cough. I've called Doc Miller to rush right over. You go to bed like a good girl. Third year. Hun, maybe you better lie down. There's nothing like a little rest when you're feeling puny. I'll bring you something to eat. We got any soup in the pantry? Fourth year. Look, dear, be sensible. After you feed the kids and get the dishes washed, you probably ought to go to bed. Fifth year. Why don't you just get up and take a couple of aspirin? Sixth year. You ought to go gargle or something instead of just sitting there and barking like a seal. Seventh year. For Pete's sake, stop sneezing. What are you trying to do? Give me pneumonia? Remember what we said. What is new becomes familiar, and what is familiar is often taken for granted. And that brings us to the second point, and the second reason that marriage is hard because of the fatigue factor. The fatigue factor. Do you remember how much time and energy you had for one another early in your relationship? Right? I mean, you guys, we would stay out until 1 minute before curfew. We wanted to spend every moment and every waking moment at least together with one another. But one of the things that's true for most folks, not everybody, but for most, is we courted our mates at a time in our lives when we had the highest levels of energy and probably the lowest levels of responsibility, right? For the most part. Somebody has said that if courtship is the dream, then marriage is the alarm clock. And so, shortly after the honeymoon, reality begins to set in, and reality can be exhausting. Maybe this will help you, appreciate a little bit about the typical week. Each Monday morning, I grab a bowl of cereal and a cup of coffee, and I'm here. And try to be here at the office, and chapel starts at 8:35, and so you've got maybe some responsibilities like I have today, and you have to speak or lead a song or say a prayer or read scripture or whatever else. And then once you get to the office right there are classes to prepare for and to put together, and assignments to grade, and emails to send, and phone calls to return, and right, and then if I'm teaching a Bible class on top of that with the annex class, or like some of you that are preaching every weekend as well, then you've got to get those lessons ready and PowerPoints put together and all those kinds of things as well. And on top of that, there are errands to run and soccer games to go to with the kids or the grandkids, and on and on and on it goes. And finally, by about 10:30 at night, you look at one another and you are exhausted, and you realize, I'm going to do this all over again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And my kids are grown. And so, does that sound familiar, at least a little bit? And under that kind of pressure, it is pretty easy to eventually settle for a marriage that is surviving instead of thriving. The reality is this: there is no such thing as a no maintenance marriage. Marriage requires investment. Sometimes it's the investment that we put off because we're too tired or we're too busy. And the distance that we allow to develop becomes a breeding ground for resentment. And that's especially true in view of the third factor that makes marriage hard. Marriage is hard also because of the flaw factor. I've said it before that dating is often meant to conceal rather than reveal. Some of us are saying, well, that didn't sound right. Think about it. I remember back when Danny and I were dating 40 some years ago, all those years ago. When I was dating Danny, I put on my best. Man, I wanted to be better than I really was, right? I mean, I wanted to leave the best impression every time that I was with her. She never saw me early in the morning with hair going 40 directions and goo in the eyes and breath that could peel wallpaper, right? I didn't want her to see that side of Kevin. She never saw me at my worst, and I wanted to make sure that was the case. And she did the same thing. And so when you or I, when we pledged to marry an imperfect mate, we rarely understood just how imperfect our mates were. Right? The I guess it's a joke. It's not that funny of a joke, but you hear the preacher and a guy comes to her and he's saying, "Man, I want a divorce. I want to get out of this marriage right here." You said, "Hey, we just did this thing 2 months ago, and you promised in this marriage right here, you promised to love her for better or for worse." And he says, "Yes, but she's worse than I took her for." There are no perfect marriages, folks, because there are no perfect people to marry. We all brought to our marriages, what are they called? Family of origin issues, right? Danny was raised by her grandmother. I was raised by my parents, and we were raised by godly people right here, but we were raised differently. And so when you come together, you bring to your marriage this mix of personalities and temperaments. And so that helps us understand why the very best marriages are unions of two good forgivers. Has to be. Has to be. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 wasn't just written out there in the midst of nothing. It's talking about relationships. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. That's not just between brother and brother. That's true in the home as well. We must come to the conclusion that that kind of commitment, guys, that takes more resources than what we have at our just up to ourselves or, on our own. That's got to come from God. Which leads to the fourth factor, the last reason this morning we'll talk about, and that is the faith factor. Marriage is hard because of the faith factor. You need to listen closely to what I'm about to say. You need to hear me well. I think that the greatest mistake that most couples make is that they put too much faith in marriage. And some of your eyebrows are about to come off like your heads. What? I think they put too much faith in marriage and not enough faith in God. What do you mean? Well, I think many of us came into our marriages saying that, I finally found that person who's going to keep my cup full, right? They made those promises. They made those vows. She's going to be there and she's going to cherish me and she's going to fill me up and she's going to replenish and nurture and everything. And so what happens when you begin to realize that not only can your mate not keep your cup full, some days she's the one drilling holes in the bottom of the cup. There are Christians that have this strange theology that you have to be married to be a whole person, which totally denies everything the Bible says about singleness. You can be complete and whole and a fulfilled person and still be a single person if that's what God designed for you. The Bible never says that marriage is where you have a half a person over here and a half a person over here and you unite them in marriage and then you have a whole person. Bible doesn't say that. That's wrong, folks. The Bible never says that marriage is what makes you full or complete or whole. Because marriage was never meant to take the place of God in your life. Strange things that Jesus says, a lot of strange things that we have to kind of shake our heads at because it's not easy to understand. One of those is found over in Luke chapter 14. Verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. What in the world, Jesus? What are you saying right here? What are you trying to get across? I think part of it is this. You cannot let anybody on earth, not even your mate, be the person that fills that God-shaped hole in your life. Let me tell you something about my wife. You don't get to see her as much around here anymore. She is a wonderful wife. She is a magnificent friend. She is a faithful helper. She's one of my most trusted advisors. But there is one thing that she is really lousy at. She makes a lousy God. She is a great blessing to my life, but she cannot be the source of my life. And so the best thing I can do for my marriage is to find my life in God. And the good news with all of that is that God wants to be the source of your life. And so we got to understand that marriage can be hard because of the familiarity factor and the fatigue factor and the flaw factor and the faith factor. And we must let God help us in our marriages. Most of us invited God to the wedding. Some of us forgot to bring him into the marriage. And those are two very different things. Marriage is too hard to make it work if, if the creator of marriage is not involved. It is a divine institution. And to work, it needs divine resources. And because God is the willing source of those resources, you can have a great marriage. Here at Sunset, we believe that. We really do believe that. Sunset loves marriages. I want you to know it doesn't matter if you're a student or if you're a guest, if you're faculty or staff. It doesn't matter who you are today out here. Sunset wants to help build your marriage. That's why we do what we do around here. In fact, next week during the workshop, there's a seminar going on, Prepare and Enrich, where you can improve and you can help others in their marriages. We've got marriage classes, we've got materials, we've got library books, we've got all kinds of things. At SIBI, we believe in marriage. And some of you know for a fact that although marriage is hard, it can become very, very good. And that's the truth.